Special thank you to my patrons for helping make this video happen. When the Southeastern Conference began play in 1932, it began with 13 teams. 10 would form the permanent nucleus of the conference, while 3 would make their exit in the decades after the SEC was formed. The Sewanee Tigers would almost immediately be outclassed by their conference mates, going winless in conference play for 9 straight seasons before leaving in 1941. 25 years later, a similar fate would befall the Tulane Green Wave, whose competitiveness had waned significantly in the years since their final conference football title in 1949. The other was Georgia Tech, who left because of a single man and his personal feud with the Southeastern Conference. Georgia Tech's eventual departure from the SEC is one you could hardly predict looking at their early history, a history firmly intertwined with the origins of Southern college football. The Yellow Jackets would be among the 13 founding members of the Southeastern Conference, and unlike Tulane and Sewanee, they'd find consistent success in their new conference, winning 5 conference titles and a national title under 2 Hall of Fame head coaches. Bill Alexander, Georgia Tech alum and John Heisman's chosen successor, would lead the Engineers of Atlanta into the SEC fresh off a 1920s that saw Tech win 5 conference titles in both the SIAA and Southern Conference, along with a recognized national title in 1928. He'd go on to win 3 of Georgia Tech's 5 SEC titles across the 30s and 40s, in the process becoming the first head coach to appear in all 4 of the era's major bowls, the Orange, Rose, Cotton, and Sugar Bowls. While never having the most elite talent on the field, Alexander would consistently, in the words of Newt Rockne, get more out of less than any coach in America, in part due to his philosophy regarding coaching. In an ecosystem of military-style drilling and hard-nosed coaching, a style his mentor largely helped popularize, Bill Alexander was the definition of a player's coach, going as far as verbally berating an assistant coach for talking down to his players after a loss to Alabama. Beyond a light hand, his relationship with his team would be one of fierce loyalty and camaraderie, an attitude that would spread to his players and, notably, his longtime backfield coach and chosen successor, Robert Lee Dodd. Bobby Dodd would not only continue but double down on the coaching philosophy his predecessor employed. The attention to strategy, the de-emphasizing of rigorous practices, and the heavy use of assistant coaches would become staples of Dodd's program. And like Bill Alexander before him, it would bring him conference titles and a national title in 1952. It would also bring him into conflict with the SEC itself. College football has always fought an internal conflict between its amateur origins and the profit it has always raked in, profits that push for a further professionalization of the sport. This never-ending conflict has been fought over a number of issues over the long history of the sport, and in the mid-20th century, the issue of the day was scholarships. Every conference across the nation had their own view on whether or not to allow athletic scholarships, and if so, to what extent, which led directly to the SEC's adoption of the 140 rule. Every year, an SEC athletic department was allowed to dole out 140 scholarships across each sport the school sponsored, with a maximum of 45 set aside for football and men's basketball. From this rule arose a problem. The limited amount of scholarships would force head coaches to drastically scale back their recruiting pool and be far more selective on who they brought in. But since this was the 1960s, high school talent evaluation was far more difficult and oftentimes inaccurate. You couldn't exactly be sure of what kind of athlete you had on your hands until they were on campus. So the coaches of the SEC hatched an idea. Promise scholarships to as many high school recruits as you want, often well above the scholarship limit, get them on campus, then cut the players that don't pan out until you reach the year's limit. It's this rule, and specifically the practice of leaving recruits high and dry before a season, that would rub Bobby Dodd the wrong way. There are schools that are signing 60 student athletes and then running half of them off every year. And we don't do that, quoted Dodd during a meeting. If we sign you, we're going to keep you. If you're not a good football player, then it's my fault, not your fault, because I invited you here. Using his influence as both Tech's athletic director and head coach, Dodd would begin to campaign for the rule's alteration or complete dismissal, a campaign across the entire SEC over the span of 3 years. The first and second votes, held in 1962 and 63 respectively, would both end in favor of the 140 rule, but the Yellow Jackets would not quit. This was a hill Bobby Dodd and his university were willing to die on, and by the time the third vote came around, the entire conference knew the stakes. If the 140 rule didn't go, Georgia Tech would. Two camps soon emerged, those with and opposed to the Yellow Jackets, each with their respective ringleaders and motivations. Standing with Tech was the Eastern SEC, consisting of the programs that both benefited the most financially from Tech's inclusion into the conference and had the closest ties to Dodd and his coaching tree. Florida, for instance, was coached by one of Dodd's former assistants, Ray Graves, and Tennessee was where Dodd played his college ball at. Auburn and Georgia, Tech's largest in-conference rivals, were also firmly on Tech's side, seeing the value the brand brought to the conference. On the other side were the Western schools, the schools Tech hardly ever played, who didn't exactly appreciate the idea of a single program being able to influence league-wide decisions by threatening to leave. At the head of this coalition was another of Tech's rivals, one with a far more personal vendetta, the Alabama Crimson Tide. The Georgia Tech-Alabama rivalry is one now mostly relegated to archived footage and a single line in Alabama's fight song. But across the 50s and 60s, the rivalry between Atlanta and Tuscaloosa was one of the SEC's best and most heated, stemming from Dodd and Bryant's personal feud, in large part fueled by the 140 rule, heating up after an alleged cheap shot an Alabama player committed, to then burst into flames after Bear Bryant, at the 11th hour of the 1963 vote, flipped his vote in favor of the 140 rule, a vote that would have ended the rule. With battle lines drawn and the vote fast approaching, Georgia Tech would announce their departure. They'd officially denied having anything to do with the impending vote, but considering the vote ended in favor of the 140 rule, it's likely Bobby Dodd and Tech's president Edwin Harrison saw the writing on the wall and pulled the plug. To this day, it's not exactly clear whether or not Tech wanted out of the SEC to begin with, using the vote as an excuse to leave. But in any case, the Yellow Jackets were officially on their own, beginning anew as college football independents. The response to Georgia Tech's exit among Tech's own alumni and fans were, on the whole, positive. As one of the South's most prominent brands, the Yellow Jackets stood to gain significantly from not having to share media and bowl payouts with the SEC, all while dropping the conference's bottom feeders from their schedules in lieu of big market teams, all while maintaining the rivalries with Georgia, Tennessee, and Auburn. They were to become the South's answer to Notre Dame, an academically prestigious, nationally recognizable independent college football powerhouse. And for the first few years, the program seemed to be heading in that direction. They played fellow independents like Penn State, Miami, Navy, and Notre Dame, a series that ended up appearing in the movie Rudy. They'd have 3 straight winning seasons in 1964, 65, and 66, and they'd finish as high as 8th in the final AP poll with an appearance in the Orange Bowl. Tech's independent future looked bright, right up until Bobby Dodd's retirement from coaching. For the first time since 1904, the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets were not coached by a Hall of Fame head coach, and under first-time head coach Bud Carson, Tech would suffer its first losing season in 17 years. 4 years later, after 2 more losing seasons, Carson would become the first Georgia Tech head coach to be fired. Bud Carson was a great coach. He was the man who constructed the cover 2 defense and coached arguably the greatest defensive unit in NFL history. But his failure in Atlanta would highlight a truth that had been hidden by Alexander and Dodd. A truth that Georgia Tech's program, as it was, strictly adhering to their recruiting and academic values, needed the perfect coach to succeed. And during the 19 years Tech spent as an independent, that perfect coach never came. Under 5 different coaches, Tech would suffer 8 losing seasons, only finishing ranked 3 times. The brand's value would slip, the school's facilities would grow more and more outdated, and soon the Yellow Jackets found themselves far behind their former conference mates. Bobby Dodd had made a mistake. Georgia Tech wanted back into the SEC. Starting in 1973, Tech would attempt to petition the conference for readmission, and soon they'd find support. Ray Graves, now Florida's athletic director, was among the most vocal in favor of Georgia Tech returning to the fold, along with, surprisingly enough, Alabama's Bear Bryant. Most in the conference, however, were unsupportive, owing both to the bad blood Tech created from their exit and the conference's number of members. 2 years after Georgia Tech left, Tulane would also leave the SEC, leaving the conference at an even 10 members. Should the Jackets be readmitted, they would need to bring another candidate with them to bring the conference to 12. And while there were talks of a possible joint move with Florida State, the Yellow Jackets' return to the SEC never materialized, and they'd languish as an independent for the rest of the 70s. They'd reached their lowest point in the early 80s, going 1-9-1 in 1980 and a dismal 1-10 in 1981. Two of the worst seasons in Georgia Tech history, only somewhat redeemed by a 3-3 tie with the number 1 ranked Notre Dame Fighting Irish in 1980, and a miraculous win over the number 2 ranked Alabama Crimson Tide in 1982. During their lowest point, the football program was in a state of limbo. The school had joined the ACC in 1979, but due to their contracts with other schools, it would take 5 years for their football team to follow, finally ending their independent experiment. Georgia Tech's departure from the SEC remains a contentious decision in hindsight. On one hand, the Yellow Jackets of Atlanta did end up rebounding from their independent malice, winning their 4th national title off an undefeated 1990 season, to then notch a handful of ACC titles into the modern day. On the other hand, whether it be late 2000s flirting with the Big Ten, or early 2020s unease over the future of the ACC, it's clear Georgia Tech has, to some extent, always wanted to be elsewhere. Their departure was officially because of a rule that 9 years after their exit would no longer be in effect. They gambled everything, their brand, their on-the-field success, their future, on their own principles. I'd like to, again, thank my patrons: Jackson Gerard, Colin Northrup, Sock, Ryan Brandenburg, Aura, Jack Hagman, Mantis Toboggan, Captain Coey, The King of War 541, William L. Jagnow, Yeah Avenue, Ryan Liu, Authentic Sims, Max Kern, Joe Sports 2022, Lance Justice, Class Jackson Lawsuit, October Rusto 2, Justin Pedraza, Cole, Nick Knudsen, Lurker, Trash Can Gus, Ease.L, Spicy Bape, The Erupturatan, Adrian Genge, Sean McWilliams, CC, The Hidden Source, Bradley Moore, at Signwood, Scarface 1, Mega Doomer, Philip, and Crossley Jones. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see y'all in the next video.